All right, get ready because we are diving deep today into some seriously old text.
Oh, yeah.
Leviticus chapter 20, straight from the King James Version of the Bible.
Interesting.
Now, you might be thinking laws and punishments from like thousands of years ago. How does that relate to me?
Okay.
But this chapter gives us a look into the social norms and beliefs of the time,
I see.
and some of these ideas might surprise you.
Okay, I'm ready.
So Leviticus 20 starts off with a pretty intense prohibition,
Uh,
sacrificing children to a deity called Molech,
hmm.
and the punishment,
Want to guess? Jail time.
death by stoning.
Oh, wow. That's a little more intense.
Not exactly a slap on the wrist, right?
No, definitely not. And it's interesting because this prohibition, it's in other parts of the Old Testament too.
Yeah, why this particular deity? What was so bad about Molech worship to these
Yeah.
people?
Yeah, good question.
Was it a purely religious thing, or was there something else going on, like societal or political factors? Think about living back then. What would drive people to do something like that?
Well, some scholars think that child sacrifice was like a desperate attempt to please a god,
Interesting.
maybe to make sure they had good crops or win a war.
Okay.
And remember, children back then were often seen as property.
Right.
So this might have been like the ultimate sacrifice.
That's pretty dark.
Yeah, it is.
So maybe this law wasn't just about being religiously pure, but also about protecting the kids, right?
Possibly. And the punishment was so severe, death by stoning, and maybe consequences for their family, too.
Yeah, that makes it seem like this was a really, really bad thing to do.
For sure.
Okay, so moving on, there's a whole section about family and sexual relationships.
Okay.
And things get pretty specific here.
Uh-oh.
We're talking adultery, incestuous relationships,
Like what kinds?
like with a father's wife or daughter-in-law,
Wow.
and homosexuality.
And all punishable by death.
Yep, all punishable by death.
That does seem harsh by today's standards.
It does.
But we have to think about the social context.
Right.
Back then, family was everything.
Okay.
The foundation of society, inheritance, even political alliances.
So even though they were severe, maybe these laws were a way to keep order and prevent chaos. I mean, the family unit was basically the building block of their whole society.
Exactly. And it's interesting that many of these laws are about the power dynamics within the family.
Okay.
Like that rule against a man having sexual relations with his daughter-in-law.
Interesting.
It's possible these laws were trying to protect women from being taken advantage of by those in positions of authority.
Now, here's one that really stands out to me. The law against cursing your parents. The punishment. Death. Talk about respecting your elders. Seems like that was really important in this society.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Think about it. Back then, there weren't any social safety nets.
True?
Caring for your elderly parents was a must for survival.
So this law wasn't just about, like, stopping teenagers from being angsty, but about making sure the older generation was cared for.
Right. Completely different from how we see things today.
Totally. All right, this next one is a tough one. Bestiality.
Okay.
Leviticus 20.15 says that both the human and the animal involved were put to death.
Wow.
It's interesting, though, this isn't just in this one text.
Really?
It pops up in laws from a bunch of different ancient cultures. Seems like it's been a taboo for a long time, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a few theories about why that might be.
What are they?
Well, one is that it comes from a need to separate humans from animals.
Hmm.
You know, like a really basic distinction in how lots of cultures understand themselves.
So it's about keeping human life sacred and not blurring those lines, right? Kind of like saying humans are humans, animals are animals.
Exactly.
Okay, now let's switch gears a bit. What about the laws around menstruation and purity? Leviticus 20.18 says no intercourse with the woman during her menstruation. This is all about ritual impurity, but it's not actually about being physically dirty, is it? It's more of a spiritual state.
You got it. Certain things like menstruation or childbirth, they were seen as temporarily separating a person from the sacred. So yeah, not about hygiene, but about keeping the sacred and the secular separate.
So like a symbolic boundary, a way to recognize these natural processes without messing up the balance of the sacred.
Exactly. And we have to remember that these purity laws were totally tied to their religious beliefs, shaping their everyday lives and how they thought about God.
So something as natural as having your period was really spiritual for them. That's so different from how we think today.
It is. And this idea of separation, of keeping the sacred and the everyday separate, leads us to one of the most important themes in Leviticus: holiness.
Let's talk about holiness because it seems to be a driving force behind a lot of these laws.
Okay.
What did it actually mean for them to be holy, and why was it so important?
Well, in Leviticus, God tells the Israelites to be holy because he is holy. But it's not just about rules.
It's about more than that.
Yeah, it's about reflecting God's character in your life, in your society.
So, like, trying to be morally and spiritually pure, both personally and as a group. Not just doing the right things, but being a certain way in the world.
Exactly. And holiness is also about staying separate from other nations and their practices. Remember, they were surrounded by groups with totally different beliefs and rituals, many of which they thought were awful.
So these laws were kind of a shield, a way to protect their relationship with God from being changed or messed up by outside things.
Exactly. It was about keeping themselves separate,
Yeah.
like a chosen people, different from everyone else and with a special purpose.
All right, so we've covered child sacrifice, family laws, ritual purity, and the idea of holiness.
Yeah, it's a lot.
We've only just started with this text, but
Right.
before we move on, there's one more law we need to talk about.
Okay, which one?
It's a really interesting one, the prohibition against magic and witchcraft.
Okay, yeah.
And just like with some other things we've talked about,
Uh-huh.
if you did this, the punishment was death by stoning.
Wow, again. They must see magic and witchcraft as really dangerous.
Yeah, but why? What was so bad about these practices to them?
Well, one idea is that magic was connected to foreign gods and practices, so it was like a threat to the religious authority.
So, like, they built their whole society around the one god, and then people start messing around with other spiritual stuff.
Exactly. Another theory is that they saw magic as a way to control nature, which was God's power.
So it's like stepping on God's toes,
Yeah.
messing with things that humans shouldn't mess with.
Exactly. Challenging how they saw the world.
And this was a time when people were much more in tune with nature.
Yeah.
So magic was a threat to the religious leaders and the natural order, kind of a double whammy.
Right. And it's fascinating that fear of magic and witchcraft has stuck around often during times of like big social changes or when things feel uncertain.
Like when things are out of control, people look for ways to explain it or feel powerful.
Maybe.
All right, so in this first part, we've gone from sacrificing children to Moloch to incest and witchcraft. This chapter really covers a lot.
It does.
Before we move on, we should talk about Matthew Henry's commentary on this chapter.
Oh, yeah. Good idea.
Matthew Henry was a 17th century minister and Bible scholar, and people still read his commentaries today.
For sure.
He had some really insightful things to say, especially about how bad child sacrifice is and the role of God's grace.
Interesting.
Yeah, he pointed out how messed up it is for parents to basically doom their kids spiritually by exposing them to this stuff.
Wow. Yeah.
And he was really clear that true holiness comes from being changed by God's grace, not just following rules on the outside.
Really powerful.
Yeah, it's like real change starts on the inside.
Right.
Not just from following rules because you're scared of being punished, but from love and wanting to be better.
Absolutely.
That really adds a whole new layer to this chapter.
It does. It makes you think that even though these old laws seem harsh to us now, they were about helping the Israelites have a deeper relationship with God.
Yeah, like a path to holiness.
Exactly. So as we've been talking about these laws, it's easy to get caught up in the specifics.
Yeah.
But I think we really have to step back and consider the bigger picture here.
What do you mean?
Well, the historical and cultural context,
Right. We can't just look at these texts with our modern ideas.
Exactly.
Like trying to understand Shakespeare without knowing anything about his time.
Exactly.
We'll miss so much.
Right. We need to understand the world how the Israelites saw it.
Okay.
And this was a time when societies were mostly defined by their religious beliefs and practices.
Right.
So for them, their promise to God, this commitment to being a holy people,
Yeah.
it wasn't just personal, it was tied to their survival as a nation.
So, like, these laws were the plan for building a society different from their neighbors, one that showed their relationship with God. They were setting themselves apart both spiritually and culturally.
Exactly. And don't forget the historical context.
Okay.
They were surrounded by cultures with very different religious practices, often polytheism, fertility cults, rituals the Israelites would have hated.
So these laws were like a wall, keeping them from being absorbed by these other cultures.
Exactly. They were trying to protect who they were, their beliefs, their whole way of life.
Like a spiritual and cultural survival thing?
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Yeah, a moral and spiritual fence around their community to protect what they thought was sacred.
Okay, I like that.
And this separation, this being set apart, that's what holiness is all about in Leviticus.
Right. God keeps telling them to be holy because he is holy.
Right.
And that holiness was everywhere, wasn't it? What they ate, their rituals, even sex.
It was about living in a way that showed their commitment to God.
Their covenant with him.
Exactly.
So these laws weren't just random rules. They were how to live their faith, practically. Like they were creating a whole spiritual ecosystem where everything was connected and had meaning.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool.
It is.
What's fascinating is that even though these laws are so old, they still connect with some basic human things that we deal with today. Like what? Give me an example.
Well, look at the laws about family.
Okay.
We might not agree with the punishments in Leviticus,
Right.
but the ideas behind them, respecting parents, being faithful in marriage, protecting people within the family,
Yeah.
those are still important in a lot of societies today.
It's like the text is working through those timeless questions about family and how to create a fair and stable society.
Exactly.
The answers might be different now, but the questions are the same.
Right. Even the laws that seem really strange now, like those about ritual purity,
Okay.
they can tell us something about how people think and how societies try to make sense of life.
I see what you mean.
Imagine trying to understand the world without science, You'd probably come up with some interesting explanations for things.
Like illness or natural disasters.
Yeah, even just like the seasons changing.
So even though we don't follow those specific laws today, we can still see the human need for order and meaning behind them.
Absolutely.
That need to connect with something bigger.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, what about that prohibition against magic and witchcraft?
Okay.
It's interesting how much people believed in that back then.
It was a big deal.
And we still see bits of it today.
Like what?
Like horoscopes or lucky charms.
Yeah.
Even being afraid of the evil eye, some cultures still believe in that.
Right.
Magic was seen as real power.
Yeah.
A way to control nature or make the gods do what you wanted.
And for the Israelites,
Yeah.
who only believed in one God,
Right.
doing magic would have been like saying, hey, God, I don't trust you to handle this, so I'll do it myself.
So it wasn't just about going against God, it was about putting your faith in something else.
Exactly. It was idolatry and also dangerous for society.
How so?
Because magic could be used for good or bad.
Right.
What if anyone could just do a spell to get whatever they wanted?
Yeah, things would be crazy.
Exactly. Chaos.
So they wanted religious purity and social stability.
Right.
They saw magic as something that could really mess things up.
Exactly. And it's interesting how this fear of magic and witchcraft pops up again and again in history.
When?
Like during the Salem witch trials,
Oh.
or when they persecuted sorcerers during the Inquisition, even in some conspiracy theories today.
When people feel like things are out of control, they want to find an explanation, a way to feel powerful.
Right, to feel like they have some control when the world seems unpredictable.
It's a very human thing, isn't it?
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about holiness, separation, family, purity, magic, witchcraft.
That's a lot.
Feels like we've only just scratched the surface of Leviticus Chapter 20.
We have more to talk about.
We do.
But I think we've done a good job laying the groundwork, understanding the main themes and historical context.
Okay.
We've seen how these laws, even though they seem harsh now, were really about real concerns.
Wait, what kinds of concerns?
About their identity, keeping society stable, and their relationship with God.
You mentioned earlier that these laws can still be relevant today.
Yeah.
Even if we don't agree with them or follow them exactly?
Right.
What do you mean by that? How can something so old connect with our modern way of thinking?
I think we need to approach these texts with humility.
Humility.
Yeah, recognizing that we're looking at them from our own time and culture,
Yeah.
It's easy to judge these practices without understanding where they came from.
And curiosity.
Yes, curiosity to understand the world, how the ancient Israelites saw it.
Right.
To understand the logic behind these laws.
Because even if we don't do things the same way they did,
Yeah.
the basic human needs are still there.
The desire for order, for meaning, for connection.
Yeah, we might do things differently now,
Right.
but those things are still part of being human.
Exactly. And by really thinking about these old texts,
Okay.
we can understand the past better,
Right.
but also ourselves and the questions that have always been important to humans.
Like a conversation with our ancestors, we can learn from them.
Absolutely.
See how things have changed.
And sometimes those conversations can be surprising.
And make you think.
Exactly.
So we've talked about holiness, separation, family, purity, magic, and witchcraft.
Yeah. A lot of ground covered.
We definitely have a lot more to unpack.
We do.
But I think this is a good foundation for understanding this chapter. Before we move on, I want to go back to something you said before
Okay.
about how these old laws can still speak to us now,
Right.
even though we might not follow them literally.
Yeah.
Can you explain that more? How can we connect those beliefs with our modern world?
I think it's about approaching these texts with, like I said, humility.
Knowing that we see things through our own lens.
Right. It's easy to judge without understanding the context.
And curiosity.
Exactly. Trying to see the world through their eyes, to get the logic and values behind these laws.
Like solving a puzzle.
Yeah. You need to understand the pieces first.
Because even if those values seem weird to us now,
Yeah.
the underlying human stuff is still there. That need for order and meaning.
Absolutely. And by engaging with these texts,
Okay.
we can understand not just the past.
But ourselves too.
Yeah, and the questions that have shaped human societies forever.
It's like talking to our ancestors.
It is.
Learning from their good and bad choices.
Right.
And getting a new perspective on our own lives.
It's true, and sometimes those conversations can be really surprising.
And make you think.
Yeah, like, why do we believe what we believe? Where did these ideas come from?
That is a good question. Back again for the final part of our deep dive into Leviticus Chapter 20.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It has. From child sacrifice to purity rituals to magic and holiness. We've covered a lot.
We have. It's amazing how these ancient laws, even if they seem strange to us now, can give us a look into a totally different way of seeing the world.
Yeah, like a world where the spiritual and the everyday were all mixed up.
Right, and where everything you did mattered,
Yeah.
like really mattered.
Speaking of things mattering, one thing that stuck out to me was all the talk about divine retribution in this chapter.
Yeah.
It seems like every action had a consequence, and they were usually pretty harsh.
Yeah, like the universe is keeping score or something. That idea of divine retribution is a big part of Leviticus and the Old Testament in general.
Okay.
The Israelites believed that if you didn't follow God's laws, you'd be punished. And not just you, the whole community too.
Like one person messes up, everyone pays the price.
The sins of the fathers are visited upon the children. That's the idea.
So it was about keeping things right with God, not just for yourself, but for the whole nation.
Exactly. It wasn't just about personal salvation.
It was about everyone.
Yeah, living in a way that would bless the whole community.
We still see this idea today, don't we? Like with the environment.
Right, for sure.
It's not just about what one person does anymore.
Right.
It's about everyone working together, taking responsibility.
We're all connected. That's the thing.
Exactly.
Maybe we don't think about divine punishment like they did,
Yeah.
but we can see how what we do affects everyone else.
Our families, our community, even the whole world.
Right? It all ripples outward.
So we've talked about the historical context, how morality has changed, divine retribution, and how we're all connected.
Lots to think about.
Is there anything else we should touch on before we finish up? Anything you think our listeners should really remember from Leviticus 20?
Well, we talked about grace before, and I think that's worth bringing up again.
Yeah, okay.
Remember Matthew Henry's commentary? He said that true holiness isn't just about doing what the rules say.
It's deeper than that.
Yeah, it's about an inner change that comes from grace.
Like he was saying, rules can only get you so far.
Exactly.
Real change has to start from within.
It's not about being afraid of punishment, but about love and wanting to be in line with something bigger than yourself.
That's a powerful idea.
It is something that goes beyond time and culture.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Leviticus chapter 20, what's the one thing you'd want our listeners to walk away with? The core of this text, without all the cultural stuff and harsh judgments.
That's a good question.
What's the wisdom that still matters today?
I'd say this. Even though the specific laws and customs might seem strange to us now,
Right.
the questions they're dealing with are still important.
Questions about what?
Morality, justice, holiness, and our relationship with God.
Right.
We might answer them differently. Our solutions might look totally different from what they did back then, but the questions themselves are still worth thinking about.
So instead of just writing these old texts off as irrelevant,
Yeah,
we should try to understand them.
absolutely.
See the world through their eyes and let their ideas challenge our own.
Like having a conversation with the past.
And who knows, maybe these ancient texts can teach us something about ourselves and the world today, if we're willing to listen.
With open hearts and minds.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's it for our deep dive into Leviticus chapter 20. We hope you enjoyed this journey with us.
It's been a pleasure.
And maybe it gave you some new things to think about.
Lots to ponder.
We hope you'll keep exploring this text, ask your own questions, and see what you can learn. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.